maintaining locomotive models. So hopefully, if I get rid of that, you can see some stuff, right?
No. Yes, now something's happening.
You
can see a presentation.
Good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about maintenance of railway models. I'm not just going to talk about locomotives. I'm going to talk about other things as well. You know, there's the question about, you know, why do you want to do this maintenance? And, you know, you want to keep it running well. And there's the question also about preventative maintenance or periodic maintenance. How often do you use the things? Are they used occasionally? Do they just come out for exhibitions? Do they live in the box? What sort of environment are they living in? Are they living in a damp and humid shed? Are they living in a shed where the stuff is, they're going to get very cold, or are they nice and warm inside the house? That will affect how often you might need to do maintenance. Also, of course, you probably remember from your train set days running them stuff on the carpet, you know, on the first day after Christmas, and by the time you'd got to New Year's Day, the things had stopped working because half the carpet, most of the cat was already inside your locomotives. And there's of course the question of whether you're going to maintain them or whether you're just going to fix them on fail. My suggestion is you actually maintain things, because fixing them on failure tends to just mean that they go wrong at the time you least want them to. But the key thing is, and those of you who have large home layouts probably have already run into this, that you can only actually, long term, you'll only ever be able to build and operate what you can maintain. So the bigger your layout, the more maintenance you've got, or the better you need to build it in the first place, both your layout and your rolling stock and everything else. Because the ultimate size of the layout you can really most usefully build and operate is the layout you can maintain. And the better you build stuff, the less maintenance you're going to have to do. So I would always suggest you build things, whether it's locomotives or rolling stock or your entire layout, build it with maintenance in mind. When you're building kits, make sure when you build a kit that you actually build it with maintenance in mind. Use steel cross-point screws. Don't use brass slotted head screws that where the heads get damaged the first time you put a screwdriver on them, and you can't get them back in the holes without a pair of tweezers, and you lose them and you end up with models with half the screws missing. And even worse is making models that are held together with a stud with a nut on the end that you've wriggled down onto it with a pair of tweezers and then soldered the brake gear on top of it. And I would suggest electrical plugs and sockets inside things. You'll notice in the picture on the right, this one of my locomotives, you can see there's a socket here and a plug here on the end of this, a plug there actually, on the end of the wire. So it means if I take the locomotive apart to do any maintenance, I can just unplug the body and then work on the chassis without having the body in the way. You know, this comes down to using the right materials. We all know that screw threads make terrible crank pins, particularly in O scale. You do need to bush the things or use shouldered screws. Brass wheels, those of you who've used brass wheels on things know very well that brass treads get dirty fast. But the biggest problem with making kits and stuff is soldering flux. Particularly acid and paste fluxes don't mix very well with steel, and they certainly don't mix very well with anything with bearings. Steel axles inside a bearing. You really do need to make sure make sure your soldering flux is completely cleaned off things, because it will come back and corrode them. And the same goes with your electrical stuff. Don't solder the wires with acid flux and stuff like that, because it will end up corroding stuff. It might take a year or two, but it will corrode it. And then you've got to ask the question about your layout as well. How are you going to clean the track? Here in the picture is some track cleaning cars that I have. There's a couple of Dapol, well, they've made by all sorts of people. Dapol have made them. Atlas have made them. Tomix in Japan have made them. I think there's only one set of molds, and somebody makes them for everybody. These are track cleaning cars. Most importantly, you can use them as a vacuum cleaner. This one's been converted to HON3, and here's another one, a Pendant style dragger car with in this case an MDF pad underneath it. You can see has already been well used. Once you've laid your track, I would avoid using any abrasive on it. when people say, "Oh, but Pico track rubber's not going to do your car, do your track any harm. Pico track rubbers are fine." My answer to that is, okay. Can I take one out and polish the paintwork on your car with it? And that's when you discover, yeah, they scratch. And I said before, build it right to begin with. Think about your wiring standards, your soldering, your track laying, and your wiring up, because you only like to lay the track on your layout once, so you need to do it right. Making some notes about it, even if documentation is just writing on the bottom of the baseboard what all the wiring does, because in 10 years time, can you remember what any of that wiring does? When you've even got the question, can you get at it when it's all covered in scenery? So, and when we come down to track cleaning, you should always use a non-polar solvent. And we'll come on to what the difference between polar and, well, we'll come on to some examples in a minute of polar and non-polar solvents. Polar solvents cause the track to get very dirty quickly. They're the kind of things with bonds between very electronegative atoms in many cases, oxygen and nitrogen, very common. And polar solvents will encourage the building up of crap on the track, the black gunk that you're all familiar with. Non-polar solvents tend to discourage that. They discourage the arcing. They discourage the buildup of metal oxides. They're things which contain bonds with atoms of similar electronegatives. And as it says, think hydrocarbons. There's some articles. It's an article, this link, which you'll be able to find in the recording, takes you to a very interesting article in Model Railroad Hobbyist from about 5 years ago. And if you Google polar solvents, the phrase polar solvent, you'll find a lot more. And here's some examples of polar solvents. Now, this one is probably about the worst stuff you can use to clean your track with, right? And I know a lot of people do it, but it's about the worst thing you can do, cleaning your track with it. And here are some other examples of things which are not good. Non-polar solvents are the best sorts of things for cleaning track, for cleaning electrical contacts. This is, of course, incredibly cheap to buy, very easy to get hold of in this country, and it's about the best solvent you can get for cleaning your track. And in fact, we'll see a bit later on, there's other useful things you can do with white spirit as well. So hopefully that's something you might be able to take away from this evening. Don't clean your track with isopropyl alcohol, which is expensive. Clean your track with white spirit, which is much cheaper. Not obviously with lots of it, but it's just used to wipe it. Here's some ideas of things you might find useful when doing maintenance on locomotives and rolling stock. Q-tips come in very useful. Moisten a Q-tip with white spirit. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. Obviously, don't get it inside the mechanism of something, because otherwise you'll end up with the cat hair problem wrapped around all your bearings. But we'll see later they can be very useful for cleaning wheels. Kitchen tissue type stuff, same sort of thing. You'll probably need the odd screwdriver, pair of tweezers. You'll need some track power, DC, DCC, whatever you use, and you may well find that some clip leads can be very useful. One's about 2 feet long. You'll need your solvents, as I said, white spirit. I quite often use airbrush cleaner, but you do need to be careful with airbrush cleaner because it's not good for plastics. It's not good for paint. It can be not good for paint work. And if you spray it on things rather too liberally, you may well find it freezes them, which for some plastics is not a good idea either, because it encourages them to crack. Fiberglass brush, very commonly used, but it's something I think you should try and avoid using too much, because the loose fibers can really cause you quite a lot of discomfort if you get them stuck in your skin. And another useful thing can quite often be a motor tool with a rubber polishing wheel. Can be very useful for cleaning wheels, particularly if you've got locomotives you haven't used for a time, or when you're finishing up a locomotive or rolling stock item, having built it from a kit, is cleaning the wheel tires, and as we'll see, the backs of the wheel of the treads as well. With a rubber polishing wheel and motor tool can often be quite neat. And you're going to need some lubricants. So I'll mention them here. You need to make sure they're plastic compatible, unless you've got an all metal locomotives. I find St. Clair Nano Oil is pretty hard to beat. You can get it from ngtrains.com in this country. It comes from other places as well. It's an American synthetic oil. The 5 weight is very thin. The 10 weight, which is what this bottle here is a little bit thicker. And then in this syringe here is the 85 weight gear grease. which you can then squirt in with that. I find this stuff really useful. The claim is that it will, in some cases in models, they claim it will halve the current consumption of the motor merely by making all the parts slip over each other much better. And I find it very useful. You can buy Electrolube from Pico Stockits. That's another quite decent thin oil. You sometimes find dry lubricants can be useful. Neolube is actually not a dry lubricant per se. It comes as a liquid. It's graphite suspended in some sort of paraffin-y stuff. You paint it on with the tip of a paintbrush, and the solvent evaporates, and you end up with a film of graphite. KD's Greasem is powdered Teflon. It's very useful for KD couplings, but it can be quite useful in a lot of other places. But to be honest, another very useful thing is the tip of a 3B pencil. You probably already got a 3B pencil somewhere close to you, but it's very useful sharpen that and use the tip of it in pinpoint bearings inside bogies and wagon side frames. You can just put tip of a 3B pencil in there, twiddle it around, and it just deposits a little bit of graphite in there, which will just help to lubricate that. And really just don't use things that I know people have said in the past, lubricate your model with 3-in-1 or GTX or whatever, because you really don't know what's in it. And certainly WD-40 is an insulator. Long term, it's an insulator. In fact, I had a story quite recently of one of my customers who said he'd got this MMI ON30 K37, which is a whacking great big locomotive, weighs about 4 pounds because it's die cast. And he said he'd got 2 of them, and one of them was terrible. It was noisy. It made squealing noises. It had never been any good since he bought it, and blah 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 blah. And could I have a look at it? And by the way, he said, I was just so frustrated with it, I turned it upside down, emptied half a can of WD-40 inside it, and it still squeaked and was and so on. So when it arrived here, and then literally, you held it up and it was dripping, WD-40 was dripping off it. All I did was lubricate the motor bearings, and it was fine. They were dry, and in fact, the gearbox bearings were knackered because they'd been run for so long dry. And squirting WD-40 in it hadn't made a heap of the difference because it hadn't got to any of those bearings. But yeah, those of you who've used WD-40 to clean locks know just how messy that stuff is. Before you do anything else with your model, whether this is a locomotive or a piece of rolling stock, visual inspection, have a look at it. Have a look for fluff and scenery bits that get wrapped around the axles. You probably, one or two of you saw that picture I posted a couple of weeks ago of a locomotive with a bit of bush stuck underneath the front axle. That actually happened on my layout. The locomotive stopped because the front truck derailed, and I looked at it, and there was this half a tree stuck underneath it. It got fallen off the scenery and got run over, just like the real thing, really. Look for things like that, stuff that gets trapped by the brake shoes, trapped around the pickups, and obviously stuff around the pickups isn't good for pickups. Look for loose and missing screws. Have a look at the pickups. Commonly on RTR locomotives, those of you with Hornby or Bachmann stuff, recent stuff in particular, make sure, slide the wheel set sideways in the frame, and make sure that you can see that the pickups are rubbing on the backs of all the wheels all the time, and I can guarantee you they won't be. And you'll find that sometimes as your locomotive goes around a corner, it stops, and you just can't work out why. But if you try sliding the wheel sets back sideways with a pair of tweezers and watch the pickups, I guarantee you see that half the pickups don't touch the wheels half the time. Look at the wiring, particularly around plugs and sockets. And those of you with Hornby locomotives know most of them have a 4-pin plug and sockets between the locomotive and the tender, as well as the A2 that I made a note about on the Facebook page about 6 weeks ago, which had the tender miswired, or the plug actually in the locomotive was miswired. I've seen quite a lot of Hornby locomotives with burnt wiring in the tender, which usually means they don't run very well. And look for that sort of stuff. May mean you end up having to rewire the tender, or take it back to the shop you purchased it from, and complain about it under warranty. And the other one that's not uncommon is split gears. Diesels. Commonly diesels are made with split axles with a plastic muff in the center of the axle as an insulator that actually has the gear on it as well. And it's not uncommon for those to split. It was very common on lifelike diesels in the 1990s and the early 2000s, but it also happens on Bachmann's split frame stuff. I've seen a few of those where you take the cover plate off and the wheels fall out, and the wheels literally just fall out of the muff because the muff itself is split. That's the sort of white plastic bit in the middle. Do a visual inspection. Here's a quick tip for finding short circuits in locomotives, which we've all sometimes been very frustrated about. It's very simple. Run the locomotive with the lights off and look for the sparks, and look for exactly where all the sparks are, and that will tell you where the short circuits are. And that can be a very useful little tip, part of your maintenance. So when it comes down to it, things to clean in a locomotive, you obviously need to clean the wheel treads. And in fact, I would recommend you clean all the wheel treads, whether they're driven wheels or whether they're carrying wheels, and whether they pick up power or not. Because if they've got dirt on the wheels, ultimately that dirt has come off the rails, and it may well get back on the rails, and you really don't want it there. So clean all your wheels, and if when you get good at it, clean your rolling stock wheels as well. If you do that once a year or once every couple of years, you'll be amazed at the amount of crap that comes off them. Even if you do use everything has metal wheels. Make sure that you clean not just the wheel treads, but if the wheels picks up through the usual springy feeler pickups, make sure that you clean the backs of the wheels where the pickups rub. And obviously at the same time, make sure the pickups are rubbing on the piece of the wheel that they're supposed to be, and not not trapped in the spokes, or, as I said earlier, not rubbing on the wheels at all. So really any current carrying rubbing contact you need to make sure you keep clean. You need to look for and get rid of muck that you'll find around axle bearings, and sometimes around motor bearings. And occasionally it's worth taking gearboxes apart and cleaning them out too. And certainly if you have a gearbox you can't take apart, giving it giving it a quick spray over with some neat white spirit from your airbrush will clean out all the old lubricant from it as well. Who's Lacey Green? Anybody know? We've got Lacey Green in the waiting room, but I've never heard of Lacey Green as a club member. Anybody know? You can unmute yourself, press the space bar.
James lives in Lacey Green or near it.
Well, let's try it and see if we recognize Lacey Green then. So when it comes down to cleaning wheels, we did wonder, Mr. Lacey Green, who you actually are.
Keith Bowler.
Ah, hello, Keith. Hi. But you appeared as Lacey Green, and we were wondering who Lacey Green might be. Okay, so cleaning wheels.
Right.
Here's one method of doing it, which is to place your locomotive on some powered track, put a piece of tissue across the rails, dampen it with some white spirit, hold the locomotive and turn on the power. Now, with this locomotive, it's quite easy because the locomotive has tender pickups, so I can just put the driving wheels on the piece of tissue and let them spin, and you can see from the bottom photograph just how much crap came off the driving wheels. Right? And I can guarantee you, if you do this, this is nothing unusual. If you've got locomotives that run on layouts, if you do that, you'll get this amount of crap come off your wheels as well. This is nothing funny about mine. These ones have ordinary plated wheel treads. Nothing fancy. The wheel treads look clean until you do that, and then you realize how much crap there is on them. But the problem with this method, while it's very good, and particularly if you've got diesels with all axles powered, this will clean your wheels on a diesel really well, because you just do one truck at a time, and then job done. But it doesn't clean the backs of the wheels if you've got pickups on them, and it doesn't clean non-powered wheels, though you can just run the thing up and down the track if you want to be able to clean the non-powered wheels. But method one works very well. Method two is one that you probably need 3 hands for. You hold your locomotive in one hand. You get a second hand. You get a Q-tip with which you dampen. With your third hand, you put some clip leads on it so that you can spin the wheels. And then you use your third hand, as I said, with the Q-tip on the wheel tread and the backs of the wheels while the wheels are spinning, and that helps keep the crap off as well. And as I said before, you can unpowered axles. You can clean that by just running them back and forth over the tissue on a piece of track. That will shift an awful lot of muck. And in fact, I'd suggest you don't just do that with your unpowered locomotive axles, do that with all your rolling stock as well, and be amazed at how much stuff comes off those.
Yeah.
I would avoid using a fiberglass brush for cleaning wheels. I know there's quite a temptation, but because you're rubbing things around the wheels while you're doing it, you've always got the risk of damaging stuff, of banging stuff in them. You're going to end up with bits of fiberglass brush everywhere inside your model. And your temptation will be to blow them off, which is a really, really bad idea, because they then be floating around in the air and they could even get in your eyes, which would be extremely unwise. So whenever you use a fiberglass brush to clean anything with, brush the bits off straight into the bin. Don't brush them off onto your workbench. Don't brush them off onto the floor. Don't brush them off onto your clothes. Straight in the bin. Because that stuff, any of you who've ever got one of those things stuck in your finger and then you spent half an hour with a pair of tweezers trying to get the damn thing out again, knows exactly what I'm talking about. When you come to lubrication, the point of lubricating things is to enable the parts that are the moving parts to slip over other bits more easily. It's to prevent wear, which is obviously good, but it also, is one of the causes of noise. Is things not slipping over each other nicely is a cause of quite a lot of, but not all of, your mechanical noise. Lubricating a mechanism that's too stiff is not going to make it any less stiff. You do need to make sure your locomotive mechanisms and everything else is properly free. I mean, you probably, those of you who are kit build locomotives know the trick, that you need to be able to run your chassis with all the motion assembled on it. For a steam locomotive, chassis with all the motion assembled needs to be able to run down a glass plate that's tilted at not a steep angle by itself, just using the friction of the wheel of the flanges on the glass. And if it can't do that, it's probably stiffness in it you need to get out. And of course, lubricating anything isn't going to get rid of any binds either. It might help to disguise them, but it's not going to get rid of them. So the things you need to lubricate are first of all, you need to lubricate the fastest moving parts. And the fastest moving part in any model are the motor bearings. Here, one motor bearing at the end of the motor here, and there's another one on this motor at the other end. I didn't take a photograph of the end of the motor, but I'm sure you can. And of course, the gearbox bearings are running at motor speed because they're just driven straight through this drive coupling. So the gearbox bearings are running at motor speed as well. And those are things to lubricate as well. The other thing to lubricate the wheel bearings. Now, this is an outside framed locomotive. So the bearing is actually in here between the wheel and the outside crank. There's the frame. There's where the bearing is in there. So however you can reach them, lubricate your wheel bearings. Lubricate the gears as well, but strictly, even though this thing has an enclosed gearbox, you can see the bottom of it in this photograph here. Even though this thing has an enclosed gearbox, resist the temptation to lubricate your gearbox with oil, particularly with the kind of thin oil that you'd be likely to use on the bearings, because the problem is that oil doesn't stick to the gear surfaces very well, and the gear surfaces will quite quickly go dry. And as we talked about, dry parts just wear. Dry gears will wear. So you should use grease on gears, because then it will stick to them and it avoids it being flung off. That nano oil grease, that nano grease I showed you that comes in that big hypodermic, the red stuff, a little squirt of that. You want a blob that's 3 or 4 millimeters across, and just let the gears splurge that around inside the gearbox. The nice thing with that red stuff is that you can actually see where it is quite easily, because it's still red. It still has a red tinge when it's smeared all over the gears. Don't forget the slide bars and the piston rods. You probably don't need to lubricate every single little pin in the motion, because they're not carrying any significant load, but it's worth on a steam engine lubricating the slide bars and lubricating the piston rod where it goes in and out of the cylinder, because you could have tight bits in that. And I would also lubricate non-powered axle bearings. And as I said, except for anything which you've got running in Delrin, so Delrin or other plastic where you've got a pinpoint end. The reason for not lubricating those is that the lubricant will attract small amounts of dust which will stick in it, and the last thing you want is a metal axle with a little bit of dust on it grinding away the inside of a plastic axle box. So what I would suggest with those ones is that's where the tip of a 3B pencil can come in very useful. And the last thing I'd say on lubrication is, before you worry about what I've said about lubrication, read what the manufacturer says because after all, he made the model and he has a good idea of how to lubricate it. So if you are looking at an RTR model, do read the manufacturer's lubrication recommendations and pay reasonable attention to them. And when it comes to actually applying lubrication, now we talk about where you want to do it. When you're applying it, if you're going to use a bottle like I showed you, that bottle of nano oil earlier, just be careful using the bottle and the applicator tube on the end of it, because it is quite easy to get quite a lot of the stuff everywhere. And of course, if you're handling the bottle itself tends to be oily, so your fingertips will be a bit oily. And the last thing you want to do is then put your oily fingertips on your model as well when you pick it up to turn it over. Much better is put a little bit of oil on something non-porous and then use a small paintbrush, tip of a small paintbrush, maybe even smaller than these that I've mentioned, or even the tip of a piece of fine wire, just to pick up a little blob and put it in the place. So you can dip it in that and then apply it to the shaft beside the bearing, so that the oil can flow into the bearing. People will tell you about using 1 drop of oil and no more than 1 drop of oil and so on. What I would say is that Peter Edwards is just joining us. What I would say is you need to be aware that too much oil is only a waste. There's no other problem with too much oil than it's a waste, and you've got the risk of it getting onto your paintwork or into the motor brush gear, which, if it does get into the brush gear of your motor, may well cause premature motor failure. So, bear that in mind. But too little oil is much worse than too much oil. Far worse, because too little oil is almost as bad as not lubricating the thing at all. It risks premature wear, it risks mechanical stiffness, and it risks then obviously the motor overheating. And the one thing you'll certainly be aware of when a model is what I said about that ON30K37, that the guy had sprayed WD-40 on it inside it, is if the motor bearings run dry, you will hear them. It will start squealing, and it will be very clear that it is dry and you need to do something about it. That's all I've got to say on that subject. So if any of you got any questions, obviously unmute yourselves.
Right, thanks, Mick.
My pleasure.
Questions? Somebody must have some questions.